No mai, haere mai. Welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. This week, China's Foreign Minister has warned the United States that it will face conflict and confrontation if it doesn't change its attitude towards China. Where will this end? Welcome, Robert.
We're in it, Bruce.
The United States admits that it is competing strongly with China and that it intends to win. What would a win look like for the US?
I think a win would look relatively modest because China is the second most powerful country after the United States in the world, and it is too big to contain. I think while most Americans are agreed that China is a threat to American, or a competitor, a strategic competitor is probably a better way of putting it, to American interests and values, many Americans disagree on what that involves in terms of dealing with it. Some Americans still seem to think that somehow America can overpower China and contain it and tie it down, or suppress it, is the Chinese term. I think other Americans are more realistic, and I think probably most members of the Biden administration are like this. They believe the crucial thing is to keep persistently reminding China how it got to the position where it got, which is a superpower through access to key Western markets like the EU, the United States and Japan, and keep putting the message across that America and its allies won't compromise on its core values of commitment to democracy and also human rights, and indicate to the Chinese that they should adjust to that reality. That is to say, I think I don't think America's seeking regime change. I think what it's trying to do is influence China in the direction which it believed China was following up to about 2009, 2010, which was a constructive partner with a different political system, but was not really trying to overturn key institutions or China's become increasingly assertive in a number of areas. So I think the United States basically wants to send the message that China has more to gain from cooperation with the United States, and it can point to the past for that message, than it has to confront the United States. It could lose a lot.
You mentioned that China has changed its approach.
Yeah.
And since 2020, Chinese foreign relations has taken this new stance, what the Chinese themselves call wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yeah.
What view of the world underpins that approach?
I think, although they gave a name to it in 2020, wolf warrior diplomacy, I think Xi Jinping's regime, since he's been in power since 2012, has essentially been following that approach, Bruce. What does it mean? It means being China-centric and quite nationalistic and asserting China's interests, even if it's at the expense of others. China's claim to over 90% of the South China Sea. China beginning to crack down in protests in Hong Kong, eroding democracy in Hong Kong, well in advance of the 2047 handover date. Taking a tougher line over Taiwan, denouncing US arms deals with Taiwan, although they've been a feature of much of the post-war period. So you see a gradual enhanced consciousness of economic and military might on the part of China, and it's been expressed in this forward-leaning, more assertive foreign policy, which the Chinese called wolf warrior diplomacy. And the other side of that coin is this assertion of power in terms of discourse is accompanied by a complete intolerance of any criticism of China. So China does not accept any criticism about human rights in relation to Uyghurs, and it basically projects the idea that the one-party system is flawless and works perfectly well, and that anyone who's criticising is interfering in Chinese affairs. China's accusing the United States of pursuing confrontation, but China's not the same power that it was, say, in 2006, 2007, it's evolved into a much more assertive great power, and that's probably contributed to the situation we're in.
So we have this growing tension between the US and China. Small countries such as New Zealand, are they always simply caught in the middle of these major power struggles? You know, how well equipped is the world community to manage superpower games?
It's not. When I say it's not, New Zealand is not doomed to be a passive or neutral player, a pawn in the game between the United States and China. Why? Because that's a sort of Cold War scenario. But lots of commentators and diplomats talk about a new Cold War between the United States and China. That is false and wrong. There's two key differences between the Cold War era and now in the 21st century. Firstly, there's no comparable system of alliances. One superpower like the Soviet Union backed by the Warsaw Pact, another superpower like the United States backed by NATO. That's gone. The economies of the US and China are inextricably intertwined. Take last year, for example. China exported about $760 billion worth of goods to the United States. It exported about $740 billion worth of goods and services to the EU. So China's well-being is inextricably intertwined with the global economy, and particularly big Western markets, including the Japanese one, although it's stretching it to call it a Western market, but it's certainly Western orientated. So that's why we're not in a Cold War. And that reality means that the small and middle players have much more scope than before. Because as we've discussed, it's a fantasy to believe that the United States or China can run the world. Whoever's successful in this period of intensified rivalry, whatever success looks like, will not run the world. The world is a big, complex place, and many of its problems are too big for even superpowers to solve on their own. COVID-19, climate change, transnational terrorism. And that gives the smaller and middle players in the 21st century an opportunity they haven't had before. So what should New Zealand be doing at this time of intensified competition? I think New Zealand has no choice but to stand up for the values that it represents, the New Zealand worldview, its emphasis on inclusion, its emphasis on democracy and its respect for human rights. And that means when there's arguments, such as the present one, about China possibly arming Russia over Ukraine, we side with the United States. But it doesn't mean we are in the US camp or we're in lockstep with the US, because there's issues which we disagree with the United States. For example, we would like to see reform in the UN Security Council. We would like to see the United States being a member of the International Criminal Court. So I suppose our mission as a small state, if you want to put it that way, is to stand our ground against authoritarian states and make no apologies for being a liberal democracy, but at the same time encourage the United States to become a much more inclusive and less exceptionalist superpower and lead through institutions rather than outside them. So we can have a positive influence. We can't do it on our own. We have to cooperate with like-minded countries, whether they be Canada, Australia, or other countries of the EU and Scandinavia, or countries in Africa and Asia. There's plenty of options. I do think New Zealand, as a small power, has a greater opportunity than ever before to have some shaping of the international order which we face.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.